Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm very, very sorry about the problems we had this morning. We had a few issues with the web link and the webinar. So I've rescheduled this to start at 11 a.m., which is now. So we're actually going to get started with the webinar. And I will have a recording available afterwards. So if anyone is unable to watch it now, or you want any friends to watch it, they're welcome to watch the replay, which we'll make available later. Okay, so I'm going to get right into the webinar now. I'll be talking about skilled migration to Australia. You're welcome to raise any questions. You can raise those at the bottom of the screen. And at the end of the webinar, I'll be very happy to go through those questions. If you don't get a chance to ask a question, or you have, you're welcome to actually raise those with me separately. And you can actually email those through. I'll give you the email address at the end of the webinar, or you can actually send them via our website. Okay, so we'll get straight into the actual webinar now. Okay, so just make sure this is all working okay after all the problems this morning. Make sure this is going well. Great. Okay, so we are ANZ Migration. We are a company based in Singapore, and we provide immigration services to Australia and New Zealand. We've been operating since the year 2003, so 12 years now in Singapore, and we only do immigration to Australia and New Zealand. Now, I think that's very important to emphasize, because there are a lot of people in Singapore providing immigration advice. We only do services where we're qualified, where we're registered and licensed to provide those services. So I think that's very, very important to emphasize. The majority of people in Singapore that provide immigration advice are actually not qualified to be doing so. And in fact, and I'll just jump forward a little bit, if you ever go to meet with a migration agent for Australia and get immigration advice for Australia, you must see this certificate on display. This is a certificate that shows the person is a registered migration agent for Australia. And it's mandatory that we have this on display. So anytime you meet with a legitimate registered migration agent for Australia, you'll always see this certificate. You don't have to ask to see it. It must be on display in the meeting room. And it shows their name, their photo, and their details. And unfortunately, as I said, the majority of people in Singapore providing immigration advice are not actually registered agents. So always look out for this certificate. If you don't see it, well then it's basically a danger sign, and you need to walk away because the person is not qualified to be doing what they're actually doing. In Australia, they'd go to jail. Unfortunately, the Australian government can't control what happens here in Singapore. So back to us. We are ANZ Migration. Now, we're actually located in the city in quite a central location. So we're just near Funan, between Clarke Quay MRT and City Hall MRT. So a very convenient location if you need to drop any documents off to us or visit the office for any reason. Now, my name is James. I'm a registered migration agent, and I'm the owner and director of the company. And I'm registered for both Australia and New Zealand. So I'm qualified to provide advice for both of these countries. Before I got into the immigration industry, I was in the IT industry, and I was a PMP certified project manager working with IBM. So that's my own background before I got into this industry. Okay. Now, these are the things we're going to talk about today. I am focused on skilled migration and skilled migration for Australia. So we'll talk about some of these benefits, the general process, and some of the things to be aware of with the process. And also I'll talk about maintaining the PR. At the end of the webinar, as I said before, I'm happy to go through any questions that people have. You're quite welcome to type the questions in during the webinar, but I actually won't look at those questions and go through them until we get to the end of the webinar process. Now, one thing I want to point out is that in Australia, the rights and benefits for a PR are essentially the same as the benefits for citizens. And I think this is important to mention because certainly in Singapore, the government wants to make a big distinction between the benefits available to PRs and the benefits available to citizens. And they want to make sure that they're quite separate because they want to encourage people to become citizens. In Australia, the government isn't trying to push you to become a citizen, and the benefits you get as a PR are essentially the same as those that a citizen in Australia would actually get. And these benefits include things like free public healthcare. So if you need to go to a public hospital, the government is going to cover your costs. And that's not insurance. It is basically a healthcare system with free public healthcare. So it's not limited in the sense that there's no caps, there's no insurance payments. It's an entitlement, it's a right that you have. We also have a wide range of social security benefits. And these include things like unemployment payments. So if you lost your job and you can't work, the government actually give you payments, and so you can pay your rent, pay your bills, and so on, until you find further work. And we have similar pensions and benefits for people that are retired and don't have an income anymore, or are disabled and can't work, and so on. Free education in public schools. At university, you pay Australian rates as a PR, and they're significantly cheaper than studying in Australia as an overseas student. We also have a lot of support for families and a lot of payments to support families with the cost of raising children. With the Medicare, the healthcare system, as I said before, this is not insurance, it is an entitlement, and it's something that's available to PRs and citizens equally. With the family payments, I thought it's good to give an example here for this. So this is quite new to a lot of people because a lot of other countries don't have systems like this. And basically what the government is saying, we recognize that raising children is expensive, and we want to help families raise children and help subsidize some of those costs. And the interesting thing with this is, it's not just for people on low incomes. You can have quite high incomes, in some cases up to $150,000 per year, and still get these benefits and these rights. So the example I've given here is for a family living in a house in Melbourne, 3 children, put an average salary in Melbourne. Average salary for a program is around $107,000 per year. Average rent for a 3-bedroom house in Melbourne is about $400 a week, or just under that. And so in this sort of situation, this family would actually get around $450 every 2 weeks from the government. Now that's not a loan. That's actually an entitlement, and it's something they can apply for immediately when they've moved to Australia. They don't have to wait for any prescribed period for this. They can actually apply for this immediately when the family is actually living in Australia as a PR. Now, there are several pathways for migration to Australia. As I said, we are going to talk about skilled migration, but just before we get into the skilled migration, I'll just quickly mention a few of the other options that are available. And it's certainly not all of them, but just a few of them we'll touch upon. Now, there are some business and investment pathways. If you are looking at migrating as an investor to Australia, you're looking at a minimum amount of 1.5 million. That's the lowest amount you can look at. There are pathways for people that own and run their own business and want to use that as a pathway to migrate to Australia. And there are retirement options for Australia as well. We also have family-based migration. Typically, the 3 kinds we see are parents. So this is if, let's say, you migrate to Australia and later on you've got parents that want to migrate to Australia. There are possibilities for parents to migrate based upon their children living and working in Australia. Partners, so a spouse. There are pathways for that. And the most commonly we see this where we have a client, they get their PR, and later they get married or have a partner and they want to sponsor that person to join them in Australia. And there are pathways for that. And there's also options for children. And this also may be a case where someone gets a PR, they have a child later and they want to sponsor the child to also get a PR with them. Now, if you are a PR and your child's born in Australia, they actually become an Australian citizen at birth. But if you are a PR and the child's born overseas, there's no status in Australia, and you actually have to apply for a PR for the child. So that's where we'll do an application such as this. And that leads us back to skilled migration, which is the main pathway I'm going to talk about today. And the interesting thing about skilled migration is it allows you to migrate to Australia and actually land there holding permanent residence without requiring a job offer. So it's very different to countries like Singapore. The normal process for Singapore would be that you You apply for a job in Singapore, the company sponsors you to come over on an employment pass or an S pass or a work permit, and then later on you may be able to look at applying for permanent residency. Whereas in Australia, you can use skilled migration to get that permanent residency. You land in Australia, and then you can apply for jobs in Australia as a local hire in Australia without requiring any job waiting for you. So some of the concepts we're going to deal with in skilled migration, I'll cover first so you understand when we talk about skilled migration what we're actually talking about. Now, the migration program, first of all, follows the financial year in Australia, and that starts on the 1st of July of each year. So at the moment, we're just into a new program year, which just started on the 1st of July. And the program year is important because a lot of the planning, changes and so on typically occur at the beginning of the program year. It's much harder to make big changes during the program year, and it's easier to implement those at the beginning of the program year. Quotas, so planning levels, the number of places available, are also maximized at the beginning of the program year. Now, when you make a skilled migration application, you can include what's called the family unit. So this is the group of people that can be included in the application. And that includes yourself as the main applicant. It includes your spouse. So your spouse is someone that obviously you're either married to or your partner to. And I say partner to because Australia recognizes couples where you may not be married, but you are living together in a committed ongoing relationship, and you can be recognized as a couple based upon that relationship. And children can be included as well. So children include not only younger children, but can also include adult children, typically up to about 25, where the children are studying in full-time study. Once the child turns 18, they're becoming an adult, and you'd still have to show that they are still part of your family. That is, they are still dependent upon you. Usually they're still studying to qualify as a child. We can include other people as well, other relatives in the application, and we call them dependent relatives. Now, for a dependent relative, the most common example would be where the father has passed away, the mother moves in with the family and lives with the family as part of the family unit. So for a dependent relative, there are 3 criteria that have to be met. And the 3 criteria are here. And the first one is the person must be single. So it could be divorced, separated, it could be widowed, or just never married. They have to be usually living with the family. So the main place of residence has to be with the family. And financially supported by the family. The main source of financial support must come from the family. So this can also be other relatives. For example, if you have maybe a brother or sister that is living with you and you support them and they're dependent upon you, then it may be possible to include them as a dependent relative. And we've had cases like that sometimes. We had one Filipino family where the parents back in the Philippines were quite poor. So one of the siblings came over to Singapore and was living with the family and supported by the family and actually studying as a full-time student. And we were able to indicate and include them as a dependent relative in the application to get PR for Australia as well. So you do have to meet all of this criteria. If there's someone that you think may meet this, just let us know and we can give you some feedback on whether or not you'll be able to include them in the application. Now, a skilled migration application hinges around what's called a nominated occupation. So the nominated occupation is one occupation that is indicated, and a lot of the criteria will depend upon the occupation you pick. You can only pick one occupation, and you must pick one occupation to actually go into the application. Now, there are lists of occupations that we refer to, and your occupation you choose must be from one of these lists. Now, there's 2 main lists that we refer to. The first one is called the Skilled Occupation List, or the SOL. And this is a list of around 180 high-demand occupations that are generally in high demand across Australia. Now, because the demand is high for these, there's no limitations on the pathways available, the different visas available for these. Then there's another list called the CSOL. This is a larger list, adds on another 400 or so occupations. Now, if your occupation is only on the larger list and not on the higher demand list, there are some limitations applied, because what they're saying effectively is your occupation is something that does have some demand in Australia, but the demand is not necessarily high or necessarily across the whole of Australia. And what the government says is if your occupation is only on this larger list, that will only let you through if your occupation is supported by one of the state or territory governments. This is one of the regions in Australia. Essentially, they're looking to one of these areas in Australia saying, we've got demand in our part of Australia for your occupation. And for that reason, we'll support this application process. And if your occupation is on this larger list, then you must have that support to get through the process. We'll talk a bit more about that in a moment and what that involves. In fact, right here's the process to actually get that support from that region is called state or territory nomination. Some people think of it as sponsorship, but technically it's called nomination. And it's where that area of Australia, and we refer to them as states or territories, acknowledges that your skills are needed there and agrees to support the application process. Now, it's important to understand it doesn't actually do anything else. It facilitates the immigration process, but it doesn't guarantee you a job, doesn't give you any funding, doesn't give you any money, and it certainly doesn't guarantee you'll get the visa. You still have to meet all these other requirements, but it's one necessary step in the process when you've got an occupation that requires this step to actually get through the process. Another important step is a skill assessment. Now, I said before that you've got to indicate an occupation called a nominated occupation. For the occupation, you must also have a successful skill assessment. And a skill assessment is a process where an authority in Australia looks at certain criteria, looks at evidence that you provide, and confirms that you meet the criteria that has been set for that occupation. So different occupations will have different requirements, and this authority will actually certify that you meet the requirements that have been set for that occupation for immigration purposes. And I emphasize that because sometimes the industry requirements or the registration or licensing requirements of some occupations can be different to what's required for this immigration process. They're not always the same. To give you some examples, if you wanted to migrate as an accountant and have a nominated occupation as an accountant, you would need the equivalent of a bachelor degree in accounting and an English language exam score equivalent to academic IELTS of 7. Now, I say equivalent of Bachelor of Accounting. For example, Australia will recognise full membership of ACCA, which is a UK accounting body, as equivalent to a bachelor degree in accounting. So there can be some other things that can be used, but this is the criteria that you must have something that's equivalent to a bachelor degree in accounting. If you wanted to go through as an ICT professional, there are several pathways, and I've listed some of the main ones here, and you'll see there's various variations depending upon whether you've got a bachelor degree or a diploma, or even don't have a qualification. So there is a pathway under ICT where you don't have an ICT qualification, but you've got extensive experience. And that's because the government recognises a lot of people in the ICT industry don't necessarily have an ICT qualification, and they've built up their knowledge and skills through work experience. Now, there are 3 visa types we deal with, and I'll run through those. The first one is skilled independent. Now, all of the visa types have a subclass, which is a 3-digit number. We usually refer to them by the subclass number. So the first one is called a 189. That's the subclass, and it's a skilled independent visa. Independent meaning that it's not sponsored or nominated. So you're going through completely on your own merits, and it leads to permanent residency in Australia, so direct to permanent residence. The second one is skilled nominated, subclass is 190. Now, this, as it suggests, requires nomination. We talked about that just before, and that's where the state or territory government agrees to support your application. And with that state nomination, you can actually get, again, permanent residency in Australia, but you've got that extra step there of getting that state nomination. And the third one, now the third one is a little bit different. The first two go directly to PR. The third one is a little bit different in that it's a two-stage process where there's first a temporary visa and then later you've got permanent residency. And this is a 489 regional sponsored visa. Now there's actually two ways to actually get this. One is using, again, state or territory nomination. So a state or territory saying they will support your application because your skills are needed, or with relatives sponsoring you in Australia. So straight away, you'll see something here, which is if you want to use relatives to sponsor your application, the only option for relatives to sponsor you is for this third option, which is a two-stage process that first gets you a temporary visa and later can allow you to move on to permanent residency. So there's no option for relative sponsorship to go directly to permanent residency. So we generally would not use relatives to sponsor you unless we need to, because if we can get you directly to PR, that's obviously the preference. We would only look for options like this third one if we can't get you directly to PR. Now I'll talk a little bit in a moment about that two-stage process and what's actually involved. Another important part of skilled migration is the points test. Now, a lot of people make a big mistake actually with the points test. They look at the points test and they only look at the points test. There's a lot of criteria for skilled migration, and the points test is only one of many criteria, but it does get a lot of focus. And it is important, but then every step is important. With the criteria for the visa, if you miss a single criteria, the application will fail. You must meet every single criteria, and passing the points test is just one of those criteria. Now, with the points test, you get points for different factors, and I've listed some of them here. This is not all of them, but it's some of the main ones that we would deal with. So, for example, under age, you'll see there's various age ranges here, and there's a number of points allocated for each range. So the prime age range is 25 to 32, and that will actually give you 30 points. So that's the prime age group. When you hit 33, you drop down to 25 points. When you hit 40, you drop down to 15 points. And when you hit 45, you drop down to 0 points. So in fact, you first lose 5 points, then you lose 10 points, then you lose 15 points. So the points loss with age is quite significant. And if you're approaching one of these age boundaries, you may have limited time and limited eligibility. So that's something to keep in mind. If you are approaching one of these age boundaries, then it's a bit more reason, if you need it, to actually get things moving earlier rather than later. I do say to people generally, you always want to do things early rather than later, because immigration requirements generally get harder over time. But age is also one of those key and more obvious changes that make things harder over time. Now, you'll also get points, and if I would just go back a moment, you'll see at the bottom here of the point sheet, points for nomination. And I've got PR and TR. So the PR, the permanent residency pathway for nomination, gives you 5 points. TR is 10 points. And I've got that actually here. So independent, as we talked about before, has no nomination, so no nomination points. If you're doing the nominated 190 pathway, which goes to PR and involves state or territory nomination, you can actually get an additional 5 points by getting that nomination from that state or territory. So getting that state or territory to say, yes, we need your skills, we agree to support your process. And that can be quite useful because you need to have at least 60 points. And if you're at 55 points, then you could look at state nomination to give you those extra 5 points you need to get to the 60 points to get through the application process. And the third option, the regional sponsored, this is the one that I talked about before that has 2 stages, temporary residence and then permanent residency. If you're getting nomination with this pathway, instead of 5 points, you actually get 10 points. Or for relative sponsors, you also get 10 points. Now, if you were at 50 points, 50, the previous nomination we talked about, 5 points here, would only get you to 55, would not get you to 60, which you need to get through the process. So it's not going to be a viable pathway. So then you might look at this third option, which would give you 10 points and get you up to 60. Obviously, we want to go to permanent residency directly when we can, but if we can't, this is not a bad option. It gets us into Australia, gets you there on a temporary visa, allows you to live and work in Australia, and you can look at applying for permanent residency later on. Now, the first stage, so as I said, there's 2 stages, the temporary visa and later the permanent visa. The first stage is actually a visa for up to 4 years, and it allows you to live and work in Australia. Now, the requirements to get PR are fairly straightforward. The 2 key requirements are to live in Australia for at least 2 years and work for at least 1 year. Now, that work can be in any occupation. So you could be an engineer going through this process, but when you get down to Australia, you could say, well, I want to rest for a bit. Maybe I'll open a bed and breakfast, or I'll open a cafe, or I'll work in a cafe, or I'll do something different. It's fine. As long as you can show that you're working. It could be self-employed. It could be working for an employer. You could manage the local McDonald's store or flip burgers in the local McDonald's. It doesn't matter. As long as you've got 1 year of full-time work, you've been living there for at least 2 years, you can then move on to full PR. Another interesting option, the second stage, meeting these requirements to go to the PR, can be met by your spouse. So you could be the main applicant to actually get the initial visa to go down to Australia. And you might decide, well, I've got a really good job at the moment. I don't want to quit just yet. Your spouse could go down to Australia and be the one that lives down there for 2 years and works for 1 year to then qualify for permanent residency. And both of these applications are family applications. So you can still be included in that PR application later as a family member, even though it's your spouse down there meeting the criteria. The relatives that can sponsor, well, are quite distant, up to a grandparent or cousin or closer. Okay. The other thing I should also note with these visas, these temporary visa, it limits you to regional areas of Australia, so not the larger cities. You are limited to smaller cities in Australia while you're there on the temporary visa. But once you get the permanent visa, there's no limitations. So this is not a bad option. Obviously, it's not the first choice, but if you can't get a direct PR, there's not a bad option because it gets you into Australia, lets you live and work there, and puts you on the pathway to get permanent residency. Now, another important part of the process is an English language exam. And of course, the first question people ask me is, do I really have to do an English language exam? You know, I've studied in English, maybe I got a GCE, A-levels English high score. The short answer is yes. Even an applicant from the US or England that is applying and needs to get points for English language ability, they have to do the English language test now. That's how strict the Australian government is. The main test we use is called the IELTS test, and that covers reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Each of these sections is graded from 0 to 9, 9 being the highest score. So typically we talk about getting a 6, 7, or 8 on the IELTS test. When we talk about these scores, we are talking about getting the required score across each of the 4 sections. So you can see here what those scores are. So an IELTS of 6 will give you no points. IELTS of 7 will give you 10 points. IELTS of 8 will give you 20 points. And these scores here refer to you getting these scores on each of the 4 sections. So to get the IELTS of 7 to get 10 points, you have to get a 7 on each of the 4 sections, the reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Each of them must be 7 or more. Now, IELTS of 6, most of our clients have no issue getting that. IELTS of 7, majority of clients would get that, but it's a bit more difficult. And IELTS of 8 is quite difficult. Very few of our clients are able to get an IELTS of 8 in each score, just a few percent. So it is very difficult. If you need to get an IELTS score of 8, by all means try, but it is going to be difficult to actually get IELTS of 8 for many people. Now, to give you an idea, these are what the average scores people get doing the test from Singapore. So it gives you an idea of what people are looking at on average. These are not our clients, these are across the board. Now, since November last year, the Australian government has introduced a few other alternative English language tests that could be done. And two of those, there's a few more, but two of them are TOEFL IBT and PTE. Now, it's still early to tell, but we've had some good signs of people doing the PTE, and they've actually been able to achieve higher scores with the PTE than they were able to achieve on the IELTS test. So that's looking promising, but it will be interesting to see over time whether that's something consistent. So you can consider these if you wish instead of the IELTS test. And there are equivalent scores. So if you're not sure, just let us know and we can let you know what the equivalent scores are compared to the IELTS test. But you may want to consider a different test like the PTE. Now, when you've got a qualification from overseas, obviously the Australian government's got to know how to weigh up that qualification. And when they weigh it up, basically they're trying to determine what's it equivalent to in Australia. Because just because you've got a certificate, let's for example, say your certificate says diploma, doesn't mean that it's going to be accepted as a diploma in Australia. Even in the Singapore context, you'll have someone that goes to a polytechnic in Singapore, studies 3 years to get a diploma. And then you've got someone that will go to some private college in Singapore, study for 6 months and get a diploma. Obviously, a 3-year full-time polytechnic qualification and a 6-month private college diploma are not going to be equivalent, and yet they're both called a diploma. So the government's got to decide what is your qualification equivalent to, and this is the scale from the lowest right up to the highest, which is your doctoral degree. So they've got to determine where your qualification sits on this scale. And Australia does a lot of research, and you can see, for example, here part of that research. This is the Australian Education Framework. So it has your education, your schooling, and then your various degrees, master's degrees, graduate certificates, and so on, right up to your PhD. And then they also look at other systems like Singapore, and we have maps like this for Philippines, India, Sri Lanka, New Zealand, all the major countries. We have maps like this, and basically what the government has to do is determine where does this qualification here fit on the Australian education framework. And once they've been able to do that, they can determine how many points are going to be allocated. And then these are the points that are given for qualifications. So certificate or diploma will give you 10 points, bachelor degree 15 points, and a PhD 20 points. There's no additional points given for a master's. In most cases, that would be treated the same as a bachelor. Now, you also get points for work experience. And we look at work experience in the last 10 years. And we're looking at 3 or more, 5 or more, or 8 or more years of experience to get the points. And the work experience must be what's referred to as skilled work experience. And there are specific rules and policies that talk about what is skilled experience. I'll try and explain this because it can be quite a complex subject. So for many people, their career would be like this. They go off, they get their qualification, degree or diploma, and they start a job, then they might go into another job. So that's, the normal progression. You get your qualification, then you start a job and start working. Now, the Australian government defines different criteria for different occupations. For example, for an engineer, and this is, let's say, a mechanical engineer, and we're talking here about a full engineer, professional level engineer, not a technician or lower level engineer. The Australian government said the skill level is equivalent to a bachelor degree. So they're saying here that for you to be considered to be working appropriately qualified as a mechanical engineer, you should have a bachelor degree. So that means that, going back to our career progression, after you've got your bachelor degree, you are considered appropriately skilled to work as an engineer, and we would consider that work experience skilled. And so what we're starting to see now, and it's not consistent with all occupations, but with many occupations, the Skill Assessing Authority will issue what's called a skilled from date. So they're saying this is the date we consider you to be qualified to be able to do skilled work. So you're able to do skilled work from this date. And if it's an engineer, and it's an engineer based upon having a bachelor degree, then your skilled from date would be the date that you actually got the bachelor degree in engineering. Let's say you got a diploma in engineering and you start working, so you got your diploma in engineering, you start working as an engineer and you continue working as an engineer. Now, you do some part-time study during your career and you get yourself a bachelor degree. So you do part-time study to get a bachelor degree. And later on, you've got this bachelor degree at this point of time. Now, we've just said the skilled from date for a professional engineer, like a mechanical engineer, is after you get the bachelor degree. So here, your skilled from date is going to be the date when you got your bachelor degree. Now, why this is important to understand, if you're looking at your work experience starts here and goes up to here. So you've got quite a lot of work experience, but we can't count the work experience before the skilled from date because you're not considered to be able to do skilled work yet. We can only consider it from the skilled from date. So actually your work experience is divided up and we can only count this bit of work experience here after you got the bachelor degree. Now, this is for a mechanical engineer. You might be a technician or a lower level engineer that only requires a diploma. In that case, we may be able to count the earlier work experience. We may be able to count this earlier work experience. So different rules, different occupations, different skill levels. Going back to ICT professionals, we talked before about the skill assessment for ICT professionals and some of the requirements. Well, ICT professionals, the skill from date is a combination of both the qualification and the work experience. So for example, for a skill assessment for an ICT professional, if you've got a bachelor degree in ICT and it's relevant to your work experience, you need 2 years of work experience. This actually forms the criteria to become skilled, a combination of both the qualification and work experience. What that means is you've got your bachelor degree in ICT, you're not yet skilled until you've got another 2 years of work experience. And then this is your skilled from date. So you would look at this and think, well, I've got 5 years of work experience. But in terms of being able to claim points for work experience, you can't actually claim the first 2 years and you can only claim the later 3 years. So you can't claim points for 5 years of experience. You can only claim points for 3 years of experience. And this can get quite complex. These are simple examples I've given. It can get a lot more complex depending upon the occupation, depending upon the situation. You can also get points for your partner meeting certain criteria, and that can give you an extra 5 points. And basically, to get those partner points, there's 3 criteria. Your partner will have to have a successful skill assessment, pass IELTS or equivalent and get at least 6 in each band, and be aged under 50. Right, so there are the concepts of skilled migration. Let's talk about the actual process and the steps we go through for applying for and getting the skilled visa. So the first 2 steps are the skill assessment and the IELTS. We talked about those before. So skill assessment is getting the recognition that your skills are needed. Sorry, not skills are needed, that you meet the requirements for your occupation in Australia, and then the English language test. Now you need both of those done before you can apply for the expression of interest. It used to be before that you would do your skill assessment and your IELTS, and then you'd go straight away and apply for the visa. The government's changed that process, and they've introduced this new step called the expression of interest. And basically, expression of interest involves you giving your information to the Australian government. You're basically putting your information into a database, and you're waiting for them to select you. And only when they select you will you be able to go ahead and apply for the visa. So what they do when they select you is then give you an invitation. So it's a letter that says, you've been selected, now you can go ahead and apply for the visa. And this allows the government to have some control over who it selects to be able to go through the visa program. So it's important to understand that that expression of interest is not yet a visa application, and it's only just a preliminary step to go through before you can get the visa application. Now, there's two ways for your EOI to be selected. The first one is through nomination by a state or territory government. So if a state or territory government agrees to nominate you, then you get selected immediately out of that database, the EOI database. The other way, if you're not being nominated, is ranking by points. So what they do is they order all of the EOIs by points, and they give places to people with the highest points first, working down the chain down to 60 points. Now, I do say here twice a month. Actually, it's now changed to once a month. So the selections based upon points are now done once a month, and they're done at the beginning of each month. Generally, we see most people at 60 or more points selected, but sometimes it can be a small bit of a queue, and sometimes you may not get selected straight away at 60 points, and you may have to wait a month or two for the next selection or the next selection after that before you get selected. So as I pointed out, special of interest, to get to the visa, you have to be selected, and you either get selected through point selection or nomination. Now, your EOI is going to have a certain number of points. Later, when you make the visa application, you'll also have a certain number of points. Hopefully, these are going to match. They should match because everything should be done correctly, and everything should line up. And if everything matches, great. Everyone's happy. Sometimes you might find that you've done EOI, and when you do your visa, the officer says, well, you're actually entitled to more points because you didn't indicate this, and the evidence shows that you're actually entitled to more points, and that's fine. It's no problem to have extra points. But if the reverse happens, you're going to be in trouble. And what this means is if your EOI has a certain number of points, and when you make your visa application, the officer determines that you are entitled to less points, you're going to be in trouble. And this can happen because the EOI is only based upon information you enter. There's no documents. It's just information that you put into the system. And the system automatically calculates your points. You don't get to choose the points. It calculates them based upon the information you enter. With a visa application, you're actually submitting the evidence, the documents, to an officer, a human officer, that looks at it and determines based upon those documents and the various policies how many points you're entitled to. And they apply various rules. Now, we talked before about the skilled from date. If I go back a moment, go back a few slides, this example here. Now, when you fill out the EOI, you'll say, okay, I got my degree, let's say in 2010, a bachelor's degree in ICT, and then I started working in 2010 as a programmer, and I worked in 2012, and then 2012 to now I've worked as a programmer for the last 3 years. The EOI does not have any entry for the skilled from date. It will just say, tell me the work experience during the last 10 years. So you say, okay, well, I started working in 2010, and I worked for 2 years, and then I started working in 2012, and I worked for 3 years. And then the EOI system will automatically give you points for 5 years. Now, as we discussed before, you're not entitled to points for 5 years because of the policy that says your skilled from date will only be after 2 years. But the EOI system is not smart enough to work that out. So you either answer it honestly and you will fail, or you have to effectively lie and leave this information out of the application. Because if you put it in there, you will fail. So you've got to actually leave it out and say, no, I was actually only working from 2012 till now, and only claim those 3 years. Otherwise, the EOI system will give you more points than you're entitled to. And if you have more points than you're entitled to, then you will fail, because under the visa application, they'll say you've got less points than the EOI had, and they have to refuse your application when that happens. It must be refused. So it can get quite tricky, can get quite messy. I've discussed this with the immigration department. It's a very difficult thing for them to solve because it's a lot more complex programming. But it will have to be fixed eventually. But for now, we have to just work around it, make sure that we don't do anything that will jeopardize the application. As I said before, expression of interest can be selected two ways. One, ranking by points. The other way is through state nomination. State nomination is where various states and territories in Australia say you've got skills we're looking for, and we agree to support your application. They do have criteria that has to be met. It's not just having the occupation. They may have other criteria as well. And some of them also have special rules. For example, some states have or have their list of occupations available, but they may allow you to use other occupations that are not normally listed if you have, for example, relatives living in that state. So there can be some special options there that can help you that would normally be available if you meet certain other special criteria. So I said before that if your occupation is on the larger CSOL list and not on the high demand list, you need nomination. And the general process would be getting the skill assessment first, then applying for the nomination, and then doing the visa. Now, I haven't put the EOI on this timeline because it's just a formality, because when your skill nomination comes through, your EOI is automatically selected. So if you're doing this, hopefully you would look at it and the nomination's available and you do the process, the nomination is still available and everything's fine. But sometimes you will start the skill assessment and you'll see that a particular state or territory is nominating your occupation, but the time you finish your skill assessment, that nomination's gone. And that's because the states and territories have a limited number of places available for nomination. And even in this new program year, which started on the 1st of July, some of those places for some states have already filled up. So this is an inherent risk in the system. And just because nomination's available when you start doesn't mean that it will continue to be available. And at some point of time, it's likely those places will be filled up. Now, if that happens, you would then have to wait and possibly wait until the next program year, starting on the 1st of July 2016, to then look at other nomination options. But sometimes you may be very interested in going to Australia, and you look and you see there's no nomination option available now. You might still go ahead and do the skill assessment. So you go ahead and do the skill assessment, even though there's no nomination available. Why won't you do that? Well, if the nomination does become available later, and it's for something that's in high demand, it's likely that it's only going to be available for a relatively short time. And by having the skill assessment done, as soon as the nomination becomes available, you can immediately apply for the nomination and get that nomination before the window availability ceases. Of course, this is a gamble because you don't know that an occupation is going to be available later. So it is a bit of a gamble, but it's going to maximize your chances. Have a chat to us if you are looking at something like this, because we can give you some feedback on whether or not we think your occupation is likely to be available at some stage later on. Of course, there's no guarantees, and this is just a guess to the best of our knowledge and based upon experience over the last 12 years. Okay, so you go through this, you get your EOI done, you can then apply for the visa. So the visa is where you supply all the evidence to support your application. For your work experience, you'll need to have detailed evidence of that work experience. And generally that will mean requiring the employer to sign off a letter going into your duties and responsibilities. The letter doesn't have to mention immigration, doesn't have to be addressed to the immigration department, but we do need something that addresses your duty and responsibilities. There are some workarounds if there's legitimate reasons why you can't get this letter. For example, we have some ICT clients that have been working with various companies, and they go back to a previous company and the company says either, first of all, it's not our policy to give a letter like this, or we can give you a letter, but the person you're working under has left the company, and so we don't know the exact details of what you're doing. So we can only give you a generic letter that says you're working here as this role. We can't talk about your specific duties and responsibilities because there's no one here who knows that information. So we do have workarounds for these kinds of situations. So just let us know if there's going to be issues in terms of getting that evidence, and we can help you with that. Requirement for recent employment evidence has been abolished. So unless there's a specific requirement, which could be the case with things like state or territory nomination, For the general visa application, there's no requirement to have recent work experience. And that's handy because it may mean that you don't need to involve or inform your current employer that you need employment evidence, which I know could be quite difficult to do. During the visa process, you will be required to undergo medical and character checks. So these are for medical checks, as you can see on the screen here, will involve a HIV test for people anyone 15 years and older, and chest x-ray for anyone who's 11 years and older. The concern for the government is the ongoing costs and the expected medical costs in Australia. And the benchmark is $40,000 over a 5-year period. So what we're essentially saying here is, if you've got a medical condition and the expected medical costs in Australia are likely to be very high, and that's typically $40,000 or more, then you're likely to fail the medical criteria. But if you've got a medical condition, it's managed, the expected medical costs are not likely to be excessively high, it's not likely to cause any major problems, then you're likely to be okay. Now, I use the word likely because obviously they're making guesses about what's going to happen in the future. But it does mean that we've had clients that have successfully passed the medical check that have diabetes, hepatitis B. We've had clients that have had cancer before. We've had clients that are amputees, partially deaf, partially blind. Clients, we have a lot of clients with high blood pressure, hypertension. I think it's very common living in Singapore for people to have stress and high blood pressure. So just because you've got a medical condition doesn't rule you out, but it is very important that if there is any medical concerns or medical conditions, anyone in your immediate family, so yourself, your spouse, your children, dependent relatives, that you let me know upfront, and I can give you some feedback on whether or not it's likely to be an issue for the process. But generally, it'll have to be quite a significant condition to cause a problem for the visa process. For character checks, we're looking for major criminal history. Typically, that means sentence for 12 months or more to jail. So if it's a minor incident, even if you went to jail for a few months, not likely to be an issue, but let me know up front. Again, just like with the medical, let me know up front, let me know the details, and I can let you know if there's any concerns there. Processing times. Well, very, very approximate. Skill assessments typically take anything from a few weeks to a few months, depending upon the authority. Expressions of interest, well, depends. State nomination, probably about a month. Ranking by points, well, 65 points, probably next round. 60 points, maybe 1 or 2 rounds, so maybe 1 to 2 months. And the visa, typically you were looking about 2 to 3 months for the actual processing, but usually there's a queue of about 5 months. So you're probably looking around six or so months for the actual visa processing as an approximate guide. These are approximate, they do vary, but will just give you a rough idea of what you're looking at. So you go through this process, you get your PR, you land in Australia holding your PR. Okay, not quite the end of the process. For those that have PR in Singapore, you know that in addition to your PR, you have a re-entry permit that allows you to travel in and out of Singapore. Very similar concept in Australia. So your permanent residence gives you literally permanent residence. That is the right to reside in Australia permanently. So you can live in Australia permanently. That's permanent residence. But something else that's very important with visas is, of course, your travel rights. Now, your travel rights aren't permanent. They are valid for 5 years. So although you can reside in Australia permanently, your right to travel to Australia is only valid for 5 years. And ideally, you want to keep that going because anytime you go overseas, you want to be able to come back to Australia as a permanent resident. And to renew for another 5 years, it's very, very simple. There's only one way, and that is to be physically in Australia for a total of 24 months. So accumulate 24 months of stay in Australia, and you can apply for another 5 years of travel rights. It's the only way to get another 5 years. There's no other way. Previously, there were options, but the rules have changed, and you can only get another 5 years if you've been living in Australia for 24 months cumulative in the last 5 years. Now, that's just time spent in Australia. So you can add up your various trips. As long as it adds up to 24 months, then you're okay. Now, it is possible to renew, not for 5 years, but for 1 year If you haven't been in Australia for the 24 months, but you can demonstrate other strong connections to Australia, then there are possibilities to renew. For example, if you went to Australia and the company there says, hey, great, you've got experience in Singapore, we're going to send you to run the Singapore office for the next 5 years. Well, obviously, you're not living in Australia, but you've been sent there by an Australian company, and you can actually use that as a basis to apply for a further travel rights, but only for 1 year at a time. So yeah, you can talk to us about this. What that means is if you're applying for your PR and you get your PR today, my normal advice would be try and move to Australia within 3 years to comfortably do the last 2 years there. But if you can't move there within the next 3 years, you can still move to Australia even just before your 5 years is up. But there are going to be some challenges with that, but it is possible to do that and still manage to renew the PR, but your renewal will be limited, and you'll need to actually have a strategy around that, and that's something we can talk to you about. Something else that's useful to know: you get PR in Australia, you are entitled to residency in New Zealand. So you get your PR for Australia, you go over to New Zealand. When you arrive in New Zealand, provided there's no issues, no criminal history, no major health concerns or anything like that, they will give you residency immediately when you arrive at the airport. No application, no fee, and you can then live and work in New Zealand as well. Unfortunately, the reverse doesn't apply. If you get residency in New Zealand, it doesn't give you any access to Australia. Only citizenship in New Zealand will allow you to live and work in Australia. So this is quite useful because we have some clients that are tossing up between Australia and New Zealand. And if they're eligible for Australia, well, then Australia is probably the better choice, because that then gives them the option of both Australia and New Zealand as places to live, work, and study. So how can we help? Well, we are one of the very few agencies in Singapore that's actually managed by a registered migration agent. As I said before, most of the agents in Singapore are not registered. And by the way, there are actually 2 registered agents. My colleague Wilson is a registered agent, and myself, James, I'm the other registered agent. So we actually have 2 registered agents. We do a lot of things to protect our clients. For example, we have indemnity insurance. Now, this is there to protect us, or actually really to protect our clients if something went wrong. Now, we don't expect to ever use this, but it's there, and it's just part of the professionalism that we make sure we follow. So this gives our clients and protects us for claims up to $1 million. Worst case, if something happens. So if a client suffered loss because of a mistake that was made, our clients can claim up to $1 million through this insurance. So we don't expect to ever use this, but you know, we make sure that we are covered and we do things correctly to protect our clients. If you are looking at choosing an agent, just a few tips. Of course, make sure you are really dealing with a registered migration agent, because most people in Singapore are not. As I said before, if you're meeting with someone who claims to be a registered agent, make sure you can see a certificate with their name, photo, showing that they are a registered agent. Always ask questions. I think it's very important to ask questions and make sure that the person is willing and able to answer the questions. I mean, if they can't answer the questions, then that's a worry, because they don't know what they're talking about. And if they're evasive and you know, they're not willing to answer the questions, well, that's also not good, because they're not going to be very helpful. It may be they've got things to hide. So just be very, very careful. Make sure that the costs are open and clear. You need to know upfront what you're looking at in terms of the cost. Very important. So anyone who's evasive, who is not making it clear, some agencies in Singapore will say, well, you've got to pay us a fee first, then we'll tell you how much you have to pay. They're trying to trap you. So be very, very careful, and don't be pressured into signing. You know, it's very unlikely a few days is going to make a difference. By all means, talk to other agents. We don't mind if you want to talk to other agents. Get different opinions. Make sure you're comfortable with what you're doing. I would always say don't sign on the spot. You know, even with us, if you come down and meet with us, go away, think about it for a day or two, then come back. Make sure you're doing the right decision. Discuss it with your family. Make sure you're doing the right thing. You're comfortable with it. And it is a big decision, and you really should treat it as such, and take your time to make the right decision. So how do we help? Well, we help with all of the process, making sure everything's done correctly, making sure from the very beginning that you're actually eligible for the pathway that you're looking at, and we do that via a free assessment. We also, and I put it here, and I've got to be careful how I approach this, identify mistakes the department makes. The department makes a lot of mistakes. DIBP is the Department of Immigration. Unfortunately, they are human, and the officers there do make mistakes. And so we often will have to go back and challenge them when they've made mistakes and get those corrected. And unfortunately, they can be quite severe. I've had a couple of applications where the officer has actually refused the application. And I've gone back and said, you've done this incorrectly. You should not have refused this because everything is done correctly. We won't submit an application unless we're very confident all of the criteria is met. And I've been able to get those turned around and get those applications granted. But it does take a bit of challenging because, of course, when you first go back, they'll say, no, we did make a mistake. We did our job correctly. And I have to escalate and sometimes go up to the assistant director and get those decisions overturned. So how are we different? Well, owned and registered by a migration agent based in Singapore. It's my company, and I'm very proud of the company. We make sure we do things honestly and professionally. There's no hidden charges. When we give you a quote, that's it. We're not going to hide any other charges. We are a small company, and so there's no GST applicable on our fees. So our fees are as you see them. There are a lot of things we do free of charge as well. For example, anytime we send documents to Australia, we send them via courier services. We don't charge you for that. And we do that because even though it's more expensive than posting, it's faster and more secure, and that's very important. If we can certify documents in our office, and then we don't charge for that. So a lot of the documents for the process can be certified and witnessed by myself or my colleague Wilson, who's also a registered agent. And if we can do that as part of our process, then we don't charge for that. It's all considered part of our service. So if you are interested, you're very welcome to visit our website, which is anzmigrate.com. There is a free assessment form on the website. And then once we've assessed that, we'll actually email you with the options available and what the costs are for that. That's a full breakdown of the costs, including our fees and the other charges. These assessments are done manually. We have to look through these, research, check. So you're not going to get a result instantly. Do allow a few days. But if it's been 2 or 3 days and you haven't got a response yet, by all means, just check with us because sometimes the emails don't go through or they end up in a spam email box. So just check with us, but do allow a few days first because we do have to manually go through those. We don't want to automate those and give people inaccurate information. We want to make sure everything is done and assessed correctly and properly. And if you are interested, if you understand the process, once you've got the costs and you want to go ahead straight away, that's fine. If you want to talk about things, well, we can arrange that. Usually, if it's just a few questions, the easiest thing is to have a short chat over the phone or just put the questions in an email. We're happy to come back to you. And, normally we say if you want like a 15-minute phone discussion, no problem. We'll just give you a phone call and we can discuss things, and that's fine. If you want to come down and actually have a more detailed discussion, we can do that. Of course, we do charge for a consultation, but that will be normally a 45-minute consultation in the office. We'll sit down, go through any questions you have. We do find that most people these days don't need consultations. With the information we have in this seminar, with covering any questions people have over a short phone call or via email, that usually addresses everything people need to know. And if you don't have the time to come down to the office, but you still want to have a consultation, we can also arrange a video consultation. And we'll actually do that over Skype or something like this, where we can actually chat. And that we also make available after hours. So usually in the morning. So if you want to do it at like 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. in the morning before you go to work, to be more convenient so you don't have to interrupt your working hours, we're happy to arrange that. And that can be arranged just by contacting my office. Okay, so that's it for the seminar. Thank you very much for joining us, and I apologize for the technical issues at the beginning. So it was a bit of a slow start, but we've got into it. If you have any questions, you're quite welcome to type them at the bottom of the screen. I will then go through the questions and answer them on this webinar live. If you don't get to ask the questions or you don't want to ask them here, or maybe they're a bit more private, just email them through. The address is on the screen, and I'll come back to you separately next week in the working week, because it's weekend now, of course, and I'll be happy to come back with answers to those questions. Thank you very much for staying with us, and I will actually start looking at the questions now and start answering those questions. So if you have any questions, put them through. Once the questions stop coming through, I will actually wrap up the webinar for today. Okay, so looking at the questions we've got so far. Okay, someone's asked, and it's Kartik, will any freelance work be considered as part of work experience? And so would testimonials be accepted as proof? So will freelance work be considered? Absolutely. The criteria for work to be considered as work experience, if we're talking here skilled work experience for points purposes, that the work experience is at least 20 hours per week. The duties are appropriate for the occupation, and you are working at a skilled level. So it doesn't matter if the work is contract, full-time, part-time, or freelance. As long as you can show you're doing at least 20 hours per week, we can consider that week as valid time towards work experience. But of course, you would have to have proof of that. It can be difficult sometimes with freelance work to prove the hours you're working. So we would normally ask you to get evidence from the client, or maybe invoicing that helps prove the hours that you're working. Someone else, Dilapan's asked a question, working as an operation executive related to housekeeping in hotels and like to migrate to Australia. It's going to be very difficult to migrate as a housekeeper. I don't believe, well, certainly under skilled migration, it's not going to be possible. And I don't believe under the general work visas like the 457, there's any options for housekeepers. So I don't believe there's going to be many options there, but you're quite welcome to send through a CV or resume, or actually fill out the assessment form. And I can actually have a look at that in a bit more detail to see if there's anything there that I could see, but it is going to be quite difficult. Sunil's asked, when will the next free seminar in Singapore be held? Well, we don't hold seminars as such anymore. We just do them via webinars. We found this to be much more easier, convenient, and easier for people to attend. So we are not doing any face-to-face seminars anymore. We just do them as webinars on the net. And I'm not sure when the next one will be, but I will keep this webinar available as a replay until the next webinar is scheduled. Okay, and I think that's it. Looks like there's no more questions at the moment. Okay, no, that's it. Great. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. Again, apologies for the interruption at the beginning. If you have any questions that are not addressed, or any questions you want to raise, just send them to the email on the screen, and we look forward to assisting you very soon. Okay, I'm going to just stop things there and wish everyone a great weekend ahead, and we look forward to helping you out very soon. Bye-bye.